Kathy Stone, what a thrill to have you. We've been delighted to have you as such a strong contributor in all of our Zoom in sessions and so many activities that we've had here for Ponga since Rootstech 2021 when we first met you. We first brought the product out to sneak it to people, and there you were, and you've been cheering us on all along the way. You come to us with decades as a personal photo organizer, and I have now since learned of how many people you have guided along the way and have such respect for the work that you've done. What's an especial thrill for us, and the reason I wanted you to join us in this Storytellers and the photo series of interviews, is that you're now looking at your own family stories. And I think come to that project with a very specialized set of skills and a very special perspective. And I'd love to have you share that for our listeners.
Well, yeah, I think the old line goes, "The shoemaker's children." So, as you said, I've been organizing other people's photos and making other people albums and all this for many years. But that has meant that I don't really have a lot of time to work on my own. And it suddenly struck me that um, I don't have all the time in the world. If we continue to say, well, I'll just do that next week, next month, well, maybe I'll take some time off in the summer and do it. And for me, I've become the repository for most of the family photos. All my mother's generation are gone, all my aunts and uncles, save one aunt on my father's side of the family. So it's falls because we can still remember being told some of the stories. And if we don't write them down, those stories are definitely going to be gone. Like a lot are gone anyway, because we didn't ask the right people at the right time. But if we don't pull together all of our memories and document that somehow in an easy way, because nobody has a lot of time for these things, those will all be lost. And to me, that's just sad. It's tragic that we lose our stories. So that's sort of what, when I first saw you at the very first Zoom at
Rootstech.
Rootstech, I just went, oh, a big light bulb went off. And I said, this might be useful for some of my clients as well, but this is what I need to do with my own, because the tendency is to want to approach it like a professional collection as I would do for a client, which is to do every single step to perfection, because that's what I do. And really, we just need to get this stuff done. We just
Yeah.
need to write it down. I need to get my cousin's stories in there. And if we get a quarter of the old pictures done, that's better than nothing. So it
Yeah.
just seemed to me to be a quick and easy way to get all their input and start just picking pictures up and going, oh, I know some stories about that. I'm going to tell the stories about behind that picture, and then I'll pull another picture out of the pile, and I'll work on that and get the stories down that I know to be
Yeah.
true and that I
Yeah.
have written documentation of.
It's like walking through your aunt's house and picking up a picture. It's not a big, structured, architected story. You've thought about that a lot. Tell me about
Mhm.
that.
I have too. I've been thinking, um, I've had a bit of a shift, because in professional photo organizing, we put a lot of emphasis on making sure everything is backed up, digitizing all your photos, letters, take pictures of things, because as we've seen, I know with you in California, and the fires, hurricanes, all sorts of natural disasters that can wipe out a whole history in a moment. I've started to see more emphasis, and again, working with a very large collection that goes back now to the 1800s for a client, I've started to see the importance of all the stories I've learned and that we've put together through bits and pieces of things, that's really like pictures from the 18 and early 1900s are very cool. I love looking at old pictures, but they don't really tell many stories, and the stories are what makes the picture, enriches the picture, and keeps the family history.
Yeah. You have some wonderful stories that you've shared, and your story is our story in many ways. It is the story of that kind of migration and settlement and, the hardship of the land. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, my grandparents immigrated from England in 1929, and they were what was known as Hudson's Bay settlement families. And they saw my grandfather was from a long line of coal miners. And if you look at the records, if you look at historical records of in the coal mines, it wasn't really a very safe job. And a lot of people passed away working. It was a bad job. It wasn't, it was a job, you got to work, but it wasn't a whole lot of fun by the look of it, and was very dangerous. So he apparently had dreamed all his life of being a farmer. And he was in a place in England where all the coal mines were, so probably not a lot of farming going on. So sometime they started it in the early 1920s, looking for settlers to come to Canada to farm, because Canada's even more back then, a big empty place. And so a lot of the land originally belonged to the Hudson's Bay Company. Actually, the original land belonged to the Indigenous people. But by the time my grandparents got involved, the Hudson's Bay had been given a big piles of this land. And so between them and the railways, who were looking for passengers, they advertised for these settlers to come to Canada. And that's how my grandparents decided to pick up the two children they had their eldest son and their daughter came to Canada under this program. So they came by ship from, I believe, Liverpool, and landed at Halifax in Nova Scotia, and then took a train all the way across to I'm assuming their train took them to Vermilion, Alberta. I think at that time the railways would have been built and existing. And then they loaded them in a car with a wagon full of all their possessions and took them out to their little plot of land. And they started farming with their kids at the time were 3 and 4. So it's not like you brought some big stocky farmhand kids with you to work. So essentially, my grandfather and my grandmother, we joke often, we're very slight. We aren't the tall side of the family, this side, and they were both fairly slight of stature. So I can't imagine how hard they worked, and especially not knowing what, I don't know, all they had was a house when they first moved in, a very small house, which was fairly rudimentary. And I've got photos of them building barns and things to keep the animals in, and plowing the fields and all sorts of things. So they worked very hard.
Did you find most of these kinds of stories, were they passed on to you with the pictures and your grandmother and your mother, or were they research that you did?
A combination of both. They were a lot of the story of them farming has always been passed down. One of my aunts and a different cousin at one point many years ago decided to track the family genealogy. So she did a lot of the research on. And but one of my aunt that had come from England at only the age of 3, she did write. She wrote a bunch of stuff out for us with the stories she remembered of all things, stories she'd been told. And so we've got some from there, and things we're just deducing from the pictures.
Right.
And
Yeah. I mean, I am struck at what a golden age we are in right now, because on one hand, we have 200 years of artifacts, and we have access to massive computing and storage power and the internet, and databases and now a large community of very knowledgeable people about different aspects of history and so on to tie these things together. The flip side's also true, as you were saying, that if we don't write this down, our line of the story, it's kind of like not having children.
and I think I'm finding that there's more interest in than digging through the messy box of photos for my kids. There's less interest in doing that than there is in hearing the stories. And I wish I'd thought to have the video camera on a ton when my mom was alive around my boys, because those were her only 2 grandchildren, my twins. And because she'd tell them stories all the time. Unfortunately, they remember some of them, which I also need to get documented, or they'll remember other details that I don't remember from being told the story.
Yeah. What do you suppose is the best way to get them telling the story? Do recordings work? Like
I think so,
voice?
because it's a digital age. So if I tell them,
Yeah.
can you just, go on your voice memo on your phone and tell the stories grandma told you. it's, I think with the technology, if you just say, or even just say, tell me the story when grandma told you about, it's a matter to track down those stories, I guess, too, and see, because I wasn't part of that conversation and I didn't even know she told them stories, but I'm not at all surprised because she loved talking and telling
Yeah.
stories. So
Yeah. A story needs a campfire, it
yeah,
needs it
yeah,
needs the people around you. It needs to be asked
yeah.
contextually.
Hmm.
And yeah, at Ponga we do think a lot about context, obviously.
Yeah.
And time and place is really important to context. You've talked a little bit about storytelling in a family as opposed to the great memoir, and that the little campfire chit chat to tell a story, to relate why
Hmm.
or how what it is about my past that endows me with the special abilities that I as the parent am giving to you. Can you tell a little bit about how that kind of storytelling works in a family?
Yeah, that well, for me, as my would have been my mom's 90th birthday this week, and so I did a little tribute for her and for my family with some pictures people may have never seen and told some stories. But even what I'm finding as I work with individual photos is, but something inspires me. It's like the magic dust comes and I remember all sorts of things that I'd forgotten. And when I wrote the tribute to my mother and I was sharing that she'd won a medal for high marks in grade 9 and got in the paper, and I had a picture and I have the medal and now I have the newspaper article. But um, when I started writing that down, I was writing, the things my mother did because I'm very proud of her. She won that medal for the highest marks in grade 9, and unfortunately, she dropped out of high school, and I can't remember what grade because of circumstances of life. But she went back and she actually finished high school the same year I did my grade 12 and graduated in there. So but she was a brilliant woman. And without that, she was a very brilliant woman. But I was trying to think of why I was saying, she was a great sister, mother, all their support roles. And then suddenly I remembered all her and I were on our own a lot of my life. And when she was able to afford a house, we started doing a ton of repairs and we learned how to, we replaced electrical outlets in the house because it didn't have 3-prong outlets.
Wow.
We read, and back then you couldn't Google it and watch the video.
No
We bought
YouTube.
a book on electricity. We bought a book on plumbing so we could
Oh, that one hot. That one's hot.
change the taps over. And we just taught ourselves how to do that. We painted. We glued our 2x4s to the ground and then glued the boards, like we glued our whole basement walls up. So I'd like to go back to that house and see if they've fallen down yet. But it started to trigger to all those things we used to do. I mentioned also there was a local park that had a skating rink, lake or a pond in the summer and a skating loop to skate around. And in those days, you didn't like have parks, dogs could go. And we'd take our 2 crazy mutts down there. And we didn't have fancy extendable leashes. We had like 15-foot long ropes. And we put the dogs on their ropes and they'd pull us around the skating rink. And it just amazed me how it doesn't take much for the memories to come flooding back. To start, it takes only a little bit. And then you start thinking about, oh, remember this and remember that. And then it just becomes a case of when you're remembering things to get them written down.
The ones that we do remember on the retelling become iconic. And on the retelling, they not only become iconic, they get passed across generations. And
Mhm.
pretty soon, those are the legends that are, again, I know I can do this because my mother glued the floors down because at the hardware store they told them that blah blah blah. So they remember those. And I
Well,
think as we look at these new technologies and new fancy dancy ways to do what has been done since the stars appeared in the sky, um, it's important to keep in mind. And what is this urge to convey in the form of a story?
and then adding to that, the final addition that will need to go with that story is when we moved into the house, which I've now lived in now for 25 years almost. I moved in with 2-month-old twins, but at some point I built shelves in our basement and storage shelves, and I went and built them, and the boys must have been like kindergarten or something because they come home, and one of my sons looks at them and he goes, "Mama, I didn't know you knew how to do things." So that kind of has to go with the story. It's like, yeah, it'd be
Yeah,
amazing how much stuff
it's
mom
amazing.
actually knows how to do.
I think every mother has that experience.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I actually can do more than make your food and go clean up after you. It's amazing. For those of us who didn't grow up with the same standard of life we enjoy now,
Mhm.
and now my kids have grown, like I said, my kids have grown up in this house, but it's a very different life than I grew up in. It's a very different life than what my mother grew up in. And I think it's important, like one of the family stories that I'm going to plunk down when I get up to the Second World War, which is when they decided to stop farming. My grandfather went away and joined the Canadian military at that point and was away guarding prisoners he was still in Canada, but he was guarding prisoners of war. But my mom told stories about before they left the farm and probably just before the war started, because 1929 probably wasn't the best time to start farming when the Great Depression was about to hit in the Dust Bowl days. So it was a very hard life. But she told stories about they'd get one egg from the chicken, and my grandfather would cut that egg into 7 pieces for the kids and his wife, and he wouldn't eat. And they ate an awful lot of boiled potatoes and an awful lot of wheat. And that's a whole different thing than here, where, where you hear we're out of this
No,
certain
grape
kind of
flavored
cheese
what?
right now. What are we going to do? And it's sort of like, yeah, that's one generation ago. So I think that's where these stories become so important, because it is part of history, because quite certainly my family wasn't the only people that lived that way.
No.
That's a part of that history, and to be able to tell it, I think, from a personal perspective adds dimension to history than just knowing the facts. My appeal now to people in these days, both not just the people who want to sit around telling old stories, the old family stories, but for anyone who's living through this time, as we all hope it will be a time that we look back on and say, yeah, that pandemic lasted for like almost 3 years. I'm going to put that on it because we're all almost at 2 already. And tell the stories. What was it like? Because as you say, we're living in we're living in a time, that's never happened before. So I've got pictures, because I decided if I had to wear masks, I wasn't going to just wear blue medical ones. So I have a whole collection of masks. So I thought I've taken pictures of myself in all my masks. I have pictures of the first time, which it was a week after Father's Day in 2020, that we actually sat down with both my boys, their significant others, and my husband. And it was a Father's Day dinner, and we had it in the backyard at tables that were 6 feet apart, because of the nature of different people's jobs in the family and some medical conditions. I hadn't seen my other son without a mask on for 3 months at that point.
Yeah.
Those are the stories people need to tell. I fortunately, I would try to say that with the right context, I hope. None of my mom wasn't alive anymore and in the nursing home, because I can't fathom what that's like. And people who've lived that experience right now, in seniors, or the people trying to look after family in care facilities right now, those stories need to be told. They're part of this experience we've lived.
That's exactly right.
And I think sometimes there's a tendency to not want to tell all the happy things. You don't want to talk about the negative things, but I think that sometimes the stories get wrapped up in that. And I think that's an important part of the Ponga program, is the ability to include things that maybe nobody will see except you, or maybe just a few people. And there's some stories, in my life that they're not going to be the ones I choose to share on Instagram to illustrate storytelling. However, they are stories that need to be told. So, well, it's interesting. I think it goes to the point of when people write their memoirs, and I'm thinking now in terms of the celebrity industry. If you're writing your memoirs, but then you're exposing stories about other people who didn't get a choice,
That's
And I
right.
think that's where it's something to think about. And I don't
Ah,
have an answer for it about
yeah.
when you have stories to tell that go with your photos and with your family history, in being thinking about or chatting with family about, are you okay if I tell that story? Are you okay if I add that story that we're now sharing? Because the whole intent of this is not to keep a secret from all our descendants, like our kids and our for those of them that already have grandchildren. This is the whole point of doing something like this, is to, it's lots of fun for us to do it. And for me, it's fun enough just to do it, but hopefully it will pass on that history. So it's, are you going to be okay with people um, telling these stories? And I think particularly about one of the ones that picture I added recently of my grandmother's family. It was taken when she was about 16, so back in England. And two of my great uncles were in the British military. One was killed in action and one was taken prisoner. And the story of my uncle that was taken prisoner is quite grisly. And I feel like you wouldn't have told that story in the day,
Right.
because my grandmother's comment that my mom carefully wrote down, thank you, was Benny was never the same when he came back from the war. Well, he was held captive in a cage. After he escaped a couple times, he was in a cage below ground, and he was, as the word used then was, mistreated. And I remember another, I can't recall who told me this, but said, yeah, that my grandmother had said um, at night he'd have nightmares and shake the bed rails. And I said, well, today we'd conclude that Uncle Benny had post-traumatic stress disorder coming
Right.
back from that experience. But back then, they probably just tried to hide it. And
Right. Right.
probably nobody knew how bad poor Benny suffered after being tortured and starved to
Right.
death. So
Right.
it's that, how many, so we tell that because, Benny's long gone, probably his own connections, but what about if it's your brother who just came back from Afghanistan?
That's right.
It's it's tough to do. It's
The
to decide
genealogists.
how much
Yeah.
to tell, yet the stories have, because I think to me that tells anyone who suffers now from post-traumatic stress disorder, yeah, these guys that went 100 years ago, that everybody goes, oh yeah, they just went there, never had any of these nervous things. Like, no, that's not true.
Right.
Something new. It's not. It's something we, obviously, because the bit of descriptions about, nightmares and never ever being quite right, that just sounds exactly like what military people still go through. So I think that's part of the value of telling those negative stories too, which is what I like too, is that you, with the ability to only share what you want to share, you can record the story still. And then down, with the ability to pass on what you've done to future generations, then someone down the road can make the decision and say, okay, well, this is so long ago now that no one would even, no one would even bat an eye. It's now just a story. It's not a thing you need to hide anymore.
Right.
And it's just a story to be told, and it's what was real. It's part of the history. It's the part that isn't in the history books.
Yeah. I want to swing back to the arc. You so impressed us early on with the 80,000 artifact, and now in terms of a storytelling task, these gigantic arcs of stories in these little micro stories in an object. How do you go back and forth across all of those? How do you tackle a problem like that?
Well, I think again, that's where I think it's important to kind of go with a workflow. And so now I'm at the point where we've managed to digitize all of it. And we're going to look at a picture, and then she's going to tell me the story behind it, just for her to tell stories, because she had a fascinating life. Her
Yeah.
mom and dad had a fascinating life. Her grandparents did. So
Yeah.
teasing her because we'd found her um, graduation photos, and we always thought she graduated from this university, and I couldn't find a diploma anywhere. And I thought, well, that's weird. Why don't we have your diploma?
Oops.
So her daughter is helping me with the project with naming things. I said, hey, I'm not sure your mother ever really actually finished university there. And so she goes, oh, so she texts her right away. And she says, I'll have you know, my diploma is on my wall in the house. So then that meant I had to get the diploma and scan it. But why she wasn't in the commencement book, she started at a midterm and she graduated sooner than they were anticipating. So, but the story she told me, which is the best one of the whole thing, is that at that commencement ceremony, her father, who was quite a very stoic man, he went around asking everyone for their programs and writing her name in them where it should have been. And it was, that's a goal. You got to write that down, because it was like, I can't really see him doing that. And boy, would I like a copy of one of them that he wrote in. Wouldn't that be a
Right.
thing to
Wouldn't
have?
that be a hoot? It's
Yeah,
funny that he didn't write in their own.
yeah, daddy went around and took people's books and wrote in them. So
Wow.
that's where you don't find those stories out unless you talk to the people who were there. You're like, that
Right.
story we would never know why her name wasn't in there. We'd just be speculating. So
Right. Well, I think that's probably a great place to end, really thinking about how important it is to tell those stories right here, right now. You also brought up this wonderful example of, what did you do during the pandemic? Each of these kinds of things that are commemorative to the point in time because they're like little links to history,
yes,
little virtual links to history. And pictures are like
they are, and often the
the
inspiration
Velcro.
to remember the stories that just seems to be. But I think that's and I think we have the tendency, first of all, to think there's always going to be time. I can ask, I can sit down with mom next year and interview her and get all these stories. Not no, we don't have time today. But you don't know what the universe has in store for you. And we always seem to have a lot of time. And my last example was a picture I shared. My mother created um, 3 pages of a traditional scrapbook many years ago, because she was going to write down her life story of her family. And she started with her mother's family, and that picture of her two uncles and her mom and everybody. And she put that in the scrapbook and did all the traditional scrapbooking things around it. And she got 2 pages done. And she had all sorts of plans to do drawings. She was like, she could really draw. She was going to draw pictures of the house as she remembered from the farm, to take place of the photos we didn't have, tell all the stories behind all those pictures. Well, sadly, she developed dementia and she couldn't do it because
Yeah,
she would sit down to work and she couldn't remember.
yeah,
So you don't have all the time in the world.
not at all.
It's You need to do this now. And if you do, which is what I'm enjoying now with playing in my Ponga account, is I can take a picture that I remember something and I can tell those stories in 15 minutes, half an hour, depending how far down rabbit holes I get going on the internet now, which is a great tool. Um, so I can do a little bit at a time, because we aren't ever going to have time to do the whole entire project.
Yeah,
And that's what I think is more important, is that any story you can record about an object or a photo is better than none.
that's right.
So we need to do it.
And you can record it in any form that works for you. And click a
Exactly.
button and
It's
record.
easy now. You
Yeah.
don't have to sit down and write it all out by hand or type it on the old typewriter and
Mm-mm. Typewriter. I think
typewriter.
of that as my sunset cruise in the evening to kind of wind down from the day.
Yeah.
Is it's a sunset cruise through my pictures,
Oh, I
and
like that.
but it does make for a very
Yes.
relaxing
And
approach.
it's so enjoyable. I'm loving it. I'm just because I'm remembering stories, and more stories come out of that. But
Yeah.
the family history, and we have a lot, like I don't have a famous family. I didn't come from, it's still, human stories are fascinating. And it's sad that we don't get to hear the stories of regular people all
That's
that
right.
often,
That's
because they're
right.
just as fascinating.
They are.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much again, Kathy. This has been
Well,
just a pleasure, and we look forward to the month of October. We'll be celebrating Family History Month with
yes,
another series of interviews like these and other activities to celebrate and engage and support those telling their family stories. Thank you so much.
wonderful. Thank you.